The Environmental Voter Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit that just does one thing. We find environmentalists who aren't voting and we turn them into better voters. That's it. That's it. Now, that also means we don't do a lot of the stuff that your typical environmental nonprofit does focus on. So we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. Oddly enough, we don't even try to persuade people to care more about climate or the environment. A good way to think of us is we are in the habit-changing business, not the mind-changing business. We find people who don't need their minds changed. They just need their voting behavior changed. And the reason we do that at the Environmental Voter Project is this. This is obviously just one poll out of millions, but right now, whether you're running for president or Senate or city council, and you poll voters who are likely to vote in your election, very, very few of them list climate or the environment as their top priority. I want to be clear here because probably many of you have seen polls saying, 80% of Americans want government action on climate change, or 70% of Americans support investing in clean energy. And those polls aren't wrong, but there's an enormous difference between priorities and preferences. And although a lot of voters prefer protecting the environment or prefer government leadership on climate, very few of them prioritize it. And that is so critically important because no matter whom we elect, whether it's the so-called right person or wrong person, they can't just snap their fingers and get whatever they want, as we're becoming increasingly clear about these days. No, they need to decide what to spend their precious political capital on. And with only 14% of presidential election voters listing climate or the environment in their top three, and believe me, when you narrow it down to top two or even top one priority, we're talking about the 3–4% range. With such small numbers of actual voters listing climate or the environment as a top priority, boy, is it hard to convince politicians to spend their political capital leading on climate. So this gets to the heart of why we do what we do at the Environmental Voter Project. Because when we started a little over 5 years ago, we realized that the reason so few voters prioritize climate and the environment is not because too few Americans do. Oddly enough, there are tens of millions of Americans who care deeply about climate and the environment. So why aren't they showing up in polls like this? Because they're not voting. It turns out that the environmental movement writ large, and especially the climate movement, doesn't have a persuasion problem. We don't have a mind-changing barrier to overcome, as much as we have a behavioral barrier to overcome. There are tens of millions of dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists out there who are already registered to vote, who just don't show up on election day. And I can't get into tons and tons of data on this because of our limited time, but just very, very quickly, looking back at actual people who voted in the voter file, we can see the 10.1 million already registered voters who were likely to list climate or the environment as their #1 priority stayed home in the 2016 presidential. 8.1 million did in November of 2020, even though that was the highest turnout presidential election in modern history. And looking ahead to this coming November, we can see on public voter files, because whether you vote or not is public record, that there are over 13 million already registered voters who have never voted in a midterm before, who we think have a really high likelihood of listing climate or the environment as a top priority. Now, I know this might frustrate some of you, but what I'd like to suggest to you, and I think the reason I'm talking to you this morning, is that this is an extraordinary opportunity. This is an enormous pool of latent political power for the environmental movement. And so what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is, as I said before, we are purely in the behavior change business. We don't tell these non-voting environmentalists who to vote for. We certainly don't tell them to care more about climate or the environment. We think they're already there. Instead, we work year-round using every election as an opportunity to change their voting habits. And we do it in 3 ways. It's a 3-step process, rather. And again, please forgive me for not going into an enormous amount of detail. We just have a short bit of time here, but there's far more information on our website, environmentalvoter.org. The first step is in identification. We work with data scientists to build predictive models, allowing us to individually identify voters on voter files who have a high likelihood of listing climate or the environment as their top priority. Yet we know from public vote history, because again, whether you vote or not is public record, that these people aren't showing up. Now, I know I just said a mouthful. Many of you are probably wondering, huh? Like, what does he mean, predictive models? There is lots more detail on our website, and we only have a little bit of time, but these are the same types of targeting techniques that sophisticated presidential campaigns and Senate campaigns use to individually identify voters. And once we find these people, well, then we know they're already with us, right? I mean, at that point, we can be completely agnostic with our messaging. Hell, we could talk about chocolate chip cookies at that point if it got these environmentalists to vote. And that's what we do. Well, we don't talk about chocolate chip cookies, but what we do is we run dozens of randomized control trials, so dozens of social science experiments every year, figuring out, once we find these non-voting environmentalists, which messages work best by text message or phone calls or canvassing or mail or digital ads to just do one thing, and that is turn them into better voters. And then the third thing is habit reinforcement. I want to be very clear, we are not some secret election-winning organization. No, our goal is long-term growth of the climate movement's political power. So what we do is we go into a state where there are lots of these non-voting environmentalists, and whenever they have an election, and I really mean that, whenever they have an election, we use it as a behavioral intervention opportunity to help starting to turn them into non-voters. I have worked in politics for over a decade, but you don't need to have my experience to know that it's really hard to change someone's habits if you only talk to them every 2 years when there's a big fancy federal election going on. Like that's not how it works. And so we don't do that either. We use every election, even ones that have nothing to do with the environment. We talk to these people for library trustee races, because the only way you change someone's voting habits is to get them to vote. And every time they have that opportunity, we want to talk to them. We are working in these 17 states. Again, I don't have time to go into why these 17 states, but very, very quickly, these are states where we've identified huge potential, by which I mean enormous numbers of these non-voting environmentalists. If you want more information about the how of what we do and the why of what we do, you can find it on environmentalvoter.org/about. Now I'm going to go into some of the results, and then I'll finish by letting you know how it's really easy for you to take advantage of this nonpartisan work and help turn these non-voting environmentalists into voters. So here are just a little bit of our results. We launched at the beginning of 2016 in a proof of concept. Then in 2018, we started to measure what our long-term impact was in these states. Now, you might remember we're now working in 17 states, but by the end of 2020, we were just in 12 states. And you'll see 730,000 of the seldom voting and non-voting environmentalists who we have spoken with, who by definition are awful voters or we wouldn't be talking to them, are now voting so consistently that they have voted in their most recent federal election, state election, and local election. They are super voters. And why is that important? It's because if you are a candidate running in one of those elections, remember what I've now said multiple times, whether you vote or not is public record. So if you're a politician running for office, you know who's a voter in your election and who's likely to not be a voter in your election. And whose opinions do you think they care about? not the non-voters. And I know that sounds cynical, but it's obvious. If you are a politician running for governor of New York and you have a public database telling you all the people who vote in that election and all the people who have never voted in that election, where are you going to spend your money? Where are you going to spend your time? Who are you going to poll to figure out whose priorities matter? Yeah, the voters. And 730,000 of these non-voting environmentalists we've been targeting over and over and over again are now these consistent super voters. Last year in 2021, we're still waiting for the second half of the year's vote history to be updated in voter files. But you'll see we were active in over 381 elections in an odd year. We were texting, calling, mailing, sending digital ads, knocking on doors. And over on the right-hand column, you'll see our results. And I want to be clear about what those results are. These are from randomized control trials. What that means is we are solely responsible for these increases in turnout, because what we did is before we spoke to our voters, we randomly removed about 20% of them and set them aside in a control group and didn't talk to them, so that after the election, we could compare turnout among the non-voting environmentalists we did communicate with and those we didn't, and thereby isolate what we were solely responsible for. In those two Georgia US Senate runoff elections that the whole world was watching in January of 2021, little old Environmental Voter Project was solely responsible for boosting turnout among our targets almost 1 percentage point. Now, it might not sound like a lot, but ask Donald Trump how big a deal 1% is. It is everything in this business, everything. If you want more information about our results, you can go to environmentalvoter.org/results. I just have 5 more minutes, so I'm going to sprint to the end. As we look ahead, obviously we are in 17 states, but I did just want to pull out 8 of those states for you. These happen to be battleground states. You'll see in that second column the number of these super environmentalists whom we are targeting, who we know from previous vote history have never, ever, ever voted in a midterm election before. So they are really unlikely to show up. These are the people we are targeting. And as you can see, we provided some context, like what does 251,000 mean in Arizona? Well, that's such a big number that that's more than 10% of all ballots that were cast last time there was a midterm election in Arizona. And so these numbers of low propensity environmental voters, I'm not going to claim we can get all 250,000 of those folks to vote. Of course we can't. But we have proven over and over and over again in randomized control trials that we can get 1, 2, 3% of them to vote. And moreover, there's a really powerful cumulative effect where if we talk to them for some of the special elections that are happening in Arizona in a few months, and then the statewide primary, and then the general, well, all of a sudden that cumulative impact is enormous. And that's where we end up pulling 730,000 of these non-voters into the electorate. So I'll close by letting you know how you can be part of this work. The first is we need volunteers. We know that we have identified these voters. We know that these predictive models are enormously precise. We know from our randomized control trials that we have the messaging that it takes to turn them from non-voters into voters. All we need is more volunteers and more money. So if you go to environmentalvoter.org/get-involved, and I'll throw that up in the next slide, you can sign up to phone bank these voters. You can sign up to write postcards to these voters. You can sign up to knock on doors. I know many of you are in New York State. Well, New York happens to be one of our states. And boy, is it important to turn the over 1 million non-voting environmentalists we've found in New York State into voters, not just for federal elections, but for state and local elections. You probably know that your state passed a green amendment last November. Well, coming up this November, there's a $3 billion climate bond measure on the ballot. We want to get environmentalists to vote. The second thing is contributions. I am not ashamed to ask for your support. We have the receipts to prove that we are turning these non-voters into voters, and we would love your help. And then finally, I'll say, I'm extraordinarily grateful to DAR for seeing me present and seeing information about the Environmental Voter Project many years ago and thinking, oh, maybe there's another venue where Nathaniel can present this information. If you want me to talk to some of your friends, if you want me to go into more depth for an hour and have a long Q&A and talk about all this, I would love to do that. And so if any of this is of interest to you, oh, I forgot about what our volunteers are saying, but I know I'm at my limit. So just trust me that our volunteers have a wonderful time. I will close just with this. These are how you can get involved. If you have any questions, you can email info@environmentalvoter.org. And I'll finally just say, I know we're all tired. I know we're living through a climate crisis. We're living through a crisis in our democracy. We are living through a pandemic. It is hard. But I also know that you wouldn't be here unless you want to make a difference. And we would love to have you join us. So thank you.
Nathaniel, thank you so much. That is just what we need to hear. If you can understand the statistics and the power of what he's doing, you can see that there is such a degree of hope, and hope requires action. And so this is our turn. I mean, I'm suggesting take out your iPhones right this second and go to the Environmental Project site and sign up to be a member. I've been a member. And it is really simple. They give tutorials for texting or tutorials for calling people. It is really simple. You can also choose what state that you want to work in. It makes it really easy. And it's interesting to pull in what Paul Hawken was saying last night about philanthropists. Not that we all have extra money that we can give away, but he's saying, if you do have money to give away, do it right now. And this is one of the wonderful places that your money can be spent. So we have a break coming up. You're going to want to come back for Alexandra Talty's session on soil sequestration, which is going to be terrific. She has got quite a set of panelists coming up. We'll see you after the break. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.